Thank you for purchasing your S&T Geotronics and Open Enigma Stick Kit. The finger joint should be stiff, but not completely impossible to put together. Now that we've assembled our top box outer frame, I'm just going to set the lid on it for the time being so that we know that the whole top box is accounted for. The two sticks will go in the front of the inner box and actually hold the plug board and be glued in there just like that. Start by taking the back of the box and making sure it fits on the bottom of the box, and then you can see that the tongue and groove fit nicely. And then we're just going to take and fit together, keeping the tongue and groove part and our numbers to the inside, and we're going to stick the bottom of the box together. We want to make sure that when we're done with this and it's glued, that it is absolutely square. Not square like as in a CAD, but square like as in square. There's many ways you can do this. You can use the carpenter's square, or you can use a fancy clamp available at a hardware store that will hold the frame top into the square clamp, and the clamp will hold that corner absolutely square. It's a good idea if you're going to go that route to maybe clamp more than one corner. If you're going to do a lot of these like we end up doing here at S&T Geotronics, you'll want to build yourself a nice gluing jig. The gluing jig basically has two barrier walls that are opposite each other that are square. And now the whole assembly is ready to push together snugly. Inspect the outside to make sure that the finger joints are at the bottom of their mortises.
Okay, so we're going to take the top of the external box, which is piece number 1, and of course, as discussed, the numbers go on the inside, So we take the top of the top, and we're going to measure it and determine where the screws are going to go, so we can go to the drill press and screw that to the frame that we just assembled. So if we measure the length of this, we see that it's basically 270 millimeters long, or 27 centimeters long. So we're going to divide this in 3. So at 9, we're going to make a mark, and at 18, we're going to make a mark. And that's where the 2 screws on this side are going to go. And then I can flip it and do the same thing. So at 9, I make a mark, and at 18, I make a mark. Alright, and then time for the other 2 screws. So at the top here, it measures 20 centimeters long, or 200 millimeters. So at 10, I make a mark, and I come down here, and I make a mark at 10. So now I have identified where my 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 screws are going to go, and I'm ready to bring this to the drill press so I can countersink these holes, and at the same time prepare the inner piece to receive it.
We're actually going to put piece number 1 onto 2, 3, 4, and 5. And for that purpose, we're going to use the drill press. You may have noticed when you were putting the screws in the top and drilling that the top is slightly larger than the actual top outer box. Well, right now we're going to address that situation. That's by design, because if the top is too small, it's a big problem. But if it's a little bit big, we can always trim it down. And we're going to do that right now with our handy belt sander. a little bit off. This side. Alright, a while ago we had dry fitted 6, 7, 8, and 9 together, and now we're actually going to glue them. This will be the first actual duty of our inner box, is we're going to use it as a spacer to actually kind of jig this together and glue it. So I'm going to take and apply my glue to my joints, just like I have all the others. Like that. I'm going to put a little glue in this groove, like so, and try not to be too excessive with it. And I'm going to put a little glue in this groove. I'm going to start about 1.5 inches away from the end, because as I squish this together with the clamp, it's going to press the glue out to the ends. And we're going to go ahead and apply some glue the same way here to this one, which is number 8. And now I've got my glue in the groove and on the finger joints. I'm going to grab the bottom here and I'm going to set it firmly in the back. Then I'm going to kind of just put this together like so, and you'll see that the glue comes out of there a little bit, and you just kind of wipe it off with your finger and wipe it on a Scott towel. And I'll grab my favorite hammer, and then I'm going to take and actually set these down. And generally, when you see the glue start to squirt out of the finger joints, you know they're good and tight. Although this side here needs another little bit of persuasion. And now you can see the glue coming out. Things to check for is to make sure that the bottom doesn't have a big gap. It has a little bit of gap right there. So I'm going to take and actually knock the bottom down into it real good. And you have a little bit of extra glue coming out. And I'll reach in there and wipe as much of that glue out of the corner as I can get reasonably. The biggest thing to do, make sure of, is that this back is seated properly against the bottom in this corner, and it's there. It's just as tight as it can be. A little bit, the belt sander will take care of all this extra glue on the bottom. And then I'm going to clamp it together. Now the first real big job of this inner box is involved in clamping. I'm going to use a couple little cardboard shims to make sure that everything stays nice and square. I'm going to insert my 2 cardboard shims between the inner box and the bottom box, and this is to ensure that there's actually enough space for the inner box and the bottom box when we're all done. And I'll just take my two little about 1.5 inch wide cardboard shims and put them in there just like that and just like that. And then I'm going to grab my clamps and apply my clamps to the bottom box to squeeze it all together nice and tight. And then I'll grab another one, somewhat larger. And as I squeeze this clamp down, it's going to actually compress the cardboard shims, which is not a big deal because they'll kind of automatically center the inner box in there, and they'll squeeze down, and about the minimum distance that they'll give you is about 20/1000 of an inch, which will be just a nice comfortable distance for your inner box to be glued at. Make sure all these are nice and tight. We'll check this seam at the bottom again, make sure it's good and snug, and as you can see, these here seams are in good shape, especially on the inside. Everything's nice and tight. We'll look at our finger joints one last time to make sure they're all the way down and that the glue is coming out, and then we'll take a Scott towel and we'll wipe as much of the glue off as we can get off, and then we'll let this bottom box assembly dry for a period of about, I don't know, 10 to 24 hours. We're going to pull our inner box out and remove our shims, and you'll see that it fits nicely with a little bit of play on either side where the shim was. We're just going to set it all together right quick to see that it all fits. You'll notice that we have just a little bit of movement, and that's due to the use of our cardboard shims, that our internal box fits nicely with just a little clearance inside our bottom box. And we're going to lay our top box on top of the whole thing, and we'll see that it indeed lines up with the bottom box real good. Everything's nice and square and they meet each other real good, and all is well. Now we're going to get ready to deal with part number 10, which is the flop that flops in the front, and we're going to be cutting and installing our two hinges, and we're going to be installing the half mortise, which is an operation we're going to use the router table for. The hinges in your stick kit should already be pre-cut, but in the event that they're not, I'm going to show you how to cut a hinge real quick. There's a little indent on the back of the hinge, that little tiny dot, and that's where they smash it to actually trap the pin inside the hinge. So we want to be careful when we're cutting our hinge to make sure is to include that in the part of the hinge we're going to keep. Now for the flop, you're going to see that the hinge is quite a bit too long and won't fit into the dado where the flop goes. So we're going to have to cut two end sections off of the hinge. Take a little file and make absolutely certain that there are no sharp edges left from the grinder. And there we have it, a hinge that now fits nicely into the flop dado. Now I've taken this little framing square and actually screwed it down to my table so it doesn't move. Now I'm going to run my outer box up against the framing square that's screwed down to the table where it won't go nowhere, and it holds my box nice and straight and to this and square to this side of the square. Now I'm going to put my flop on here like this. Now I'm going to take a clamp and clamp him down in a minute, but I'm going to put him in the center of his slot so there's an equal amount of distance between this edge of the dado and that edge of the dado, and the flop is right in the middle, and the box is pushed against the square so my distances will remain the same. I'm going to take one of my little clamps and I'm going to clamp the flop down to the table, keeping it square against the square and centered where it goes from each other. I'm going to lay the hinge into position. Now I'm going to push the hinge down. I'm going to lay a file or a straight edge over the top of the box and the hinge. Now I'm going to push it together until my hinge is touching my straight edge, because I want my hinge to be kind of nice and mounted as high on this bevel as I can get it. And then I'm going to get my pencil and hold my hinge in there with my straight edge like that, and I'm going to mark all my screw holes for where I'm going to put the hinge. I'm going to set my drill bit in. This is a teeny tiny drill bit. It's actually a 3/32 bit. For these tiny screws you can use a 1/16, and I've got my bit stuck in my drill so that it's just the length of the screw, because I surely don't want to drill through the bottom of this. Now I'm going to take my drill motor and I'm going to now I'm ready to take and mount my hinge to the box. Been my experience that sometimes the hinge manufacturer sends fatter hinges than other times, and this hinge is 0.17 inches thick. Now we're gonna have to make a mortise in the ends of the lid, in the end of the lid, and in the bottom box to accept this hinge, so that when we assemble our box, that he closes and isn't sitting on top of the hinge, having a nearly 1/4 inch gap. So we're going to go to the router table, and we're going to set the router table up, and then we're going to cut the mortise in for the hinge. Now I've adjusted the router machine here so that it will cut a groove in the back of the box and in the top of the back of the top, so that when you put the two pieces together, that it has room inside of it to accept the hinge, and the hinge will be inside of there. And I usually like to start with a middle screw because there's more room. And I'll take my screw and put it in my screwdriver and get it lined up with the hole. And then I'll start driving it into the wood. And then we'll see how badly we messed up. Oh, it's pretty close, but there is just a little bit of offset, and there always is. I've never made one that's ever been perfectly square. And there's two ways that we can deal with this. One is that we can try and manipulate our screws a little bit and loosen these screws up, and then close it and tweak it over a little bit and attempt to hold it tweaked, and then retighten our screws. And once we get it as close as we humanly can with the screws, then we'll move on to the belt sander and we'll just sand this little bit of extra off. box opens and it closes nice and square all together. The seam is very tiny because we've mortised our hinge in real well, and it's ready for final sanding and finishing once we put the half mortise lock in. And now we're going to get to the point where we're going to install the half mortise. I've removed piece number 10 again, just took the screws out of it, and I've got it here with me now that it's all trimmed to the right height. And now we're going to put this mortise into the piece so that we can install our half mortise lock, which fits into that notch just like that. And I've set the router up to cut the first step of it, which is this little indentation in the top right here. And basically I use a quarter inch straight mortising bit, and I've got my guide set up to stop it both ways, and I'm just going to push it up to the fence, and it'll cut that little slot for me. Set the router back down, and I'm going to get my sandpaper. I'm going to put a little bit of sand a little bit the edges here to get the fuzz off. And now you can see that I have this little slot for the half mortise top to countersink down in, and it's about right, but the corners are rounded, and actually use a sharp chisel to make them square. Voila, we have a nice square mortise in the top of our flop, which our lock will sit down in. Now I've moved the fence back a little bit so that I can cut this deeper mortise notch for the lock itself inside. The first step of that, and I'm going to turn on the router. Now you can see that the big part of the mortise for the lock to sit in is there, and the lock fits in it pretty well. Now I've readjusted the fence and the position, the end stops, and I'm going to cut the deep part of this out with the router. Now you can see the deep part where the actual lock body is going to sit in is cut out, and I'll kind of slide my lock up, and oh, you realize it doesn't quite all fit. That's because there's a couple little pieces that protrude from the lock body, but those cuts I'm going to go ahead and make with my chisel. I'm going to look at it, I'm going to lay my lock down in there and kind of gander in, and I'll just a little bit of pressure, cut that little piece of wood away, and then I'll come over on this other side and cut a little bit of wood away there, so that it ends up like that. And then our half mortise should fit in this groove. The half mortise still doesn't sit all the way down because he's actually resting on his pin that sticks out of him just a little bit. And I'm going to get a pencil and make a mark with it so we can drill our keyhole. Now I'm going to take the pencil and I'm just going to run the lead of the pencil on this little pin that sticks out. Some pencil lead will get on it. And then I'm going to take and set the half mortise into the flop. This isn't the one we're actually working on, but it'll show better on this where the camera can see it. And I'm just going to take the end of my chisel and tap, tap, tap. And now you can see there's a nice pencil mark on the inside of the flop, and that's where we'll drill the keyhole. Now I'm going to look at the lock, and you see the round part of the keyhole. You need to find a drill bit that's maybe just a tiny bit larger than the keyhole round part, or similar size. And then you're going to line it up on the dot that we made with the pencil. Always put something behind it when you're drilling through. That'll stop it from splintering out the bottom. And we're going to drill. And that gives us the round part of our keyhole. And now we're going to grab a Dremel with a tiny little burr bit in it, and we're going to make the slotted part of the keyhole. And now you can see that we have a keyhole in our flop, and that the key indeed fits in the keyhole. Now that we have our half mortise cut in the flop and the keyhole put in, now we're going to open the real working lock. There's a screw actually in the lock. I'll have to retrieve him. Okay, there's 4 screws. We're going to line up our lock behind our keyhole to make sure that the pin is in the center of the hole. And then we're going to take our drill and we're going to start some holes. I always lean them to the outside of the lock a little bit because the wood is so thin, right dead under the screw holes of these. So I cheat a little bit and lean them out. You'll see that the holes are indeed very close to the edges, so I drill them out at an angle just a little bit so as that it makes it a little bit stronger. And then I'll install the screws that hold the half mortise lock into the flop. And there you have an installed half mortise lock, which is just recessed below the edge just a little bit, and it's in its half mortise and it's mounted, and we can put our key in and we can test to see that the latch of the lock indeed works, and the key comes out, key goes in, unlocks, comes out. Now I'm going to reattach the flop back to the box as we had before using the 4 number 1 screws, and make sure it's all good and tight. Alright, then I'm going to close my flop back up. I'm going to take the other piece of the half mortise lock, I'm going to put it into the flop, like that, and then I'm going to actually lock the lock and verify that indeed it's in there and locked. And now I'm going to close the lid. I'm going to push my flop up. Make sure that this is straight. I'm going to close my lid down on it. I'm going to give it a bump. Just like that. That bump drove these two little spikes into the lid right there and gave me a mark of where I'm going to want to cut my mortise in for this top. You can of course use the wood chisel to do this if you're really good, or I prefer to use my handy dandy Dremel tool with a tiny burr bit. I'll start my Dremel running. Make these little holes a little bigger so you don't lose track of them. It doesn't have to be perfect underneath, because the little brass piece will cover most of your sins. Sometimes I'll take my wood chisel just to clean it up anyway. And there we have it. A little space for that to flip in. Now I'm going to lay it back down closed and verify that I've got it cut deep enough, and I do. Because if it's not deep enough, it'll raise it up and make this crack bigger in the front than it is in the back. That looks pretty good right there. So now I'm going to unlock my lock and recover my little piece. Sometimes they have a little bit of extra material on them from where they drill the hole, and you take a file and you clean it up for them a little bit, and that be that. And now we'll flip our box upside down and we'll put our top of our mortise lock in its little mortise. We'll grab the drill motor one more time and drill us for our screws. And we'll grab the last two screws and install them. And now our lock catch is in its little mortise, and we're going to close the flop, close the lock catch, and see that our box opens and closes. Sometimes they're a little stiff to start with. This one is no exception, so we'll have to clean this latch up a little more with the file. Pretty much successful there. And we'll lock it to ensure that it does indeed lock and that our cabinet is nice and closed and looks good all the way around. And now we're done assembling our Open Enigma wooden sticks kit